After the Russian Tsar Nicholas II abdicated in 1917, the provisional government, led by Duma member Alexander Kerensky, held onto power until October. Vladimir Lenin's return to Russia allowed him to galvanize his supporters, the Russian communist faction known as the Bolsheviks. The Bolshevik seizure of power in October of 1917 signaled the end of Russia's short-lived hope of becoming a fully democratic country. Vladimir Lenin established himself as the supreme leader of a new nation, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. A brutal civil war between Bolshevik and anti-Bolshevik factions would rage between 1918 and 1922, leading to the deaths of millions of Russians. Lenin's tenure as the Soviet Union's leader would be marked by repression, violence, economic changes, and a power struggle following his death in 1924. Joseph Stalin, a Bolshevik leader from the remote province of Georgia, would emerge from the power struggle against his opponent, Leon Trotsky. Stalin would rule the Soviet Union from 1928 to 1953, overseeing rapid industrialization and brutal repression. After the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed in March 1918, Russia, now the Soviet Union, was no longer at war with Germany. Within Soviet Russia, there were still many parties who opposed the rise of the Bolshevik government. The civil war in Soviet Russia was made up of the Bolsheviks, who were Lenin's communist supporters. Opponents of the Bolsheviks included supporters of the Tsar and the provisional government. The Bolshevik factions were known as the Reds, while the anti-Bolshevik factions were collectively known as Whites. The Tsar and his family were executed by order of Lenin in July of 1918 in the mountain town of Yekaterinburg. The Bolsheviks eradicated the white forces, many of whom were killed or fled into exile. Surviving members of the Russian nobility and merchant classes sought asylum in Finland, northern China, France, and Great Britain. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were communists or followers of Karl Marx's political and economic theories. The Bolsheviks professed to believe in a classless society where all land and industry was communally owned. Lenin's rhetoric of freedom and equality was superficial, as he became a dictator and his Bolshevik party became agents of severe repression. To stamp out dissent, Lenin created a secret police force to spy on and monitor the citizens of Soviet Russia. The Cheka was initially formed in December of 1917 and was used by Lenin to arrest, try, and execute any Soviet citizens suspected of opposing Bolshevik power. The Red Terror began in September of 1918 and marked the beginning of the bloody campaign to root out and kill anyone who opposed or might oppose Lenin's dominance. Lenin regarded members of the bourgeoisie, the term Karl Marx used to designate middle-class land and business owners, as the greatest threat to his control. By 1920, the Cheka was the most powerful arm of the Bolshevik government. The Russian Orthodox Church, which had been Russia's state church for millennia, was heavily suppressed. Many Russian Orthodox clergy were killed or exiled and churches destroyed. The Bolshevik government was officially atheist, and they viewed any religious organization as an ideological threat to their campaign to control all aspects of Soviet life. Gulags, or prison labor camps, which were typically located out in the Russian tundra of Siberia, became the Soviet government's chief tool of terror. Those who could not flee or were not executed immediately by the government were held in gulags, where they were forced to do manual labor in deprived conditions. By the end of 1923, there were over 300 gulags containing about 70,000 political prisoners. Lenin's persecution of the kulaks, the Russian class of landed farmers, compounded the food shortages the country was facing in the wake of conflict. The Soviet economy remained stagnant as the Bolsheviks tried to take control over all of the country's lands and industries, which led to dire shortages of food and goods. Between 1920 and 1922, famine led to an estimated 5 million deaths from starvation across Soviet Russia. This disaster prompted Lenin to realize relaxation of his government's hold on the economy was needed as soldiers and civilians began to riot in Moscow. The new economic, policy, or NEP, was implemented towards the end of 1921 and lasted until Lenin's death in 1924. The NEP was a departure from the earlier attempts of strict government control of all enterprise. Under the NEP, independent farmers were allowed to work their own land and sell their produce at market. Similarly, small business operations were allowed to commence, bringing a boost to the Soviet Union's shattered economy. Lenin's death left the Bolshevik Party with a power void. Different members of the Soviet Politburo, or main governing body, vied to lead the country. Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin were both contenders to fill Lenin's shoes. Leon Trotsky had been involved with communist politics since 1898 and had been imprisoned under the Tsar's rule for his radical affiliations. Trotsky was a devout Bolshevik and had opposed the NEP on the grounds that it was too capitalistic. In the end, it was Joseph Stalin, the Georgian-born upstart, who seized regions of leadership in the Politburo. By 1928, Stalin was the most powerful man in the Soviet Union. Trotsky was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1929 and continued to denounce Stalin from his exile in Mexico. In 1940, an assassin employed by Stalin inflicted a fatal wound to Trotsky's head with an ice pick, a gruesome reminder that Joseph Stalin did not tolerate dissent. Stalin dissolved the NEP and pushed for total governmental control of all agriculture and industry. Collectivization of agriculture, which involved the organization of farm workers into vast government-run estates, was met with a great deal of opposition from the kulaks. The kulaks, or land-owning farmers, had benefited a great deal from the NEP and wanted to maintain their control over their lands. In order to stomp down the kulaks' resistance, Stalin ordered police and army forces to seize grain, crops, and livestock from kulak farmers in southern Russia and the Ukraine. Southern Russia and the Ukraine were the breadbasket regions of the Soviet Union, and the seizure of agricultural products between 1930 and 1932. This use of man-made terror famine led to the deaths of close to 6 million farming families and is regarded by historians as a genocidal campaign by starvation. Along with forced collectivization of agriculture, Stalin formed plans for rapid industrialization. The first five-year plan, between 1928 and 1932, oversaw the creation of heavy industry, construction, and transportation, making the Soviet Union an industrial power. With all economic output under state control, the Soviet Union was a centrally planned economy with no private enterprise or competing businesses. Stalin relied on ample propaganda to create a cult of personality surrounding his leadership, meaning he was elevated to the position of a godlike ruler in an otherwise atheistic country. All news media was controlled by Stalin and those loyal to him, and it became the job of radio and print to glorify him as a great leader who could do no wrong. The Soviet Union grew in its industrial capacity, but remained a repressive dictatorship. Stalin continued to expand the Gulag systems, using prison labor to complete major infrastructure projects like building canals, expanding roads, and laying railway tracks. In 1934, Stalin created a new secret police service called the NKVD to help him maintain his absolute power. The NKVD functioned much like Lenin's Cheka had and oversaw the arrests, killings, and incarceration of millions of Soviet citizens. Stalin's desire to control all aspects of the economy, military, and public life meant his rule was totalitarian. Fearing a potential coup from military authorities, Stalin carried out his Great Purge from 1936 to 1938. The Great Purge led to the arrest and killings of many senior government and military officials whom Stalin believed were potential rivals for power. Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, along with their Bolshevik henchmen, had brought radical changes to Soviet Russia, a nation that was a repressive but industrialized power. By 1939, Europe was on the brink of another major conflict in which Stalin and the Soviet Union would become belligerents. Stalin would help Hitler partition Poland in September of 1939 and then mount an invasion of neighboring Finland that winter. By 1940, the Soviet Union would ally itself with Britain and France to fight off Nazi Germany, losing millions more of its citizens in a bloody Second World War. Stalin died in his sleep in 1953, a muted end for a man who caused so much bloodshed. Let's review some key points from this lesson on the creation of Soviet Russia. The secret police organizations that operated in the Soviet Union during the 1920s and 1930s included A, the NKVD, B, the Kulaks, C, the Cheka, D, the Politburo, or E, both A and C. E is the correct answer.